I'm Alfonso Winker.
And I'm Trina Olson. And together, we're the co-founders of Team Dynamics.
And this is Behave. I want to talk today about my favorite subject. They might all be my favorite.
Yeah, but this might be your extra special favorite.
Yeah, it's like a top tier favorite.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I want to talk about goals.
What kind of goals?
Specifically, having equity or inclusion or diversity goals in your workplace. And I think the corner of the goals world that I want to live in today is a conversation around how we can get overwhelmed by trying to create a generically or generally equitable or inclusive workplace.
Sure.
And that while goals might feel stressful or like what happens when we only pay attention to a couple of things, they actually can make creating those environments, I don't want to say easier, but more possible. So when we have a really specific goal, we can move toward it by building more practices rather than just saying like, in general, we want to be equitable, inclusive all the time. And it's sort of like for what, for why, what would be different, what would be better for whom.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a couple things. It's an invitation to be more explicit. So I might be wandering around with goals that you don't know that I have.
Right.
So then my behavior might be a surprise or a disappointment, right? And that idea of getting specific enough to be able to have an action to do something about, right? And when I think about how my goals continue to evolve, both for myself, for our organization, for the organizations we support, we consistently talk about all of our work being goal-directed or we're just wandering. And I do think that purposeful action rather than generic or general is the difference between really making large-scale, tangible change and getting constantly frustrated that things don't feel like they're moving.
Right. And because I think we hear a lot of folks say like, oh, well, equity for me means, and they're like really thinking about ability and disability and access. And then other folks are like, I'm really thinking about race and the ways in which like Black and brown job candidates are pushed out of our process. So specific goals also help us not be in a sort of hierarchy of which kinds of equity we're working on. We can just say for this period of time, we're going to get super specific and zoom in. And you can have a lot of goals. It's not saying like you can only address race and you can't address accessibility or disability or ability or access at the same time. But we have to know that we're working on that and that you're not working on one set of goals and I'm not working on the other one if we're trying to have this sort of collective organizational experience.
Yeah. When I think about what it has been like to develop more and more specific goals, I think about how so many of the folks that we support when we first meet them really have goals about mix. And it's generally so broad, they just want more of a mix of people, or they feel like their mix isn't enough. How do you help people dig in on sort of more useful mix goals?
So I think the question first, when folks are wanting to change the mix of who works there, whether it's across lines of gender, race, educational experience, religion, etc., the first is to have them reflect on what is the current mix and what do you feel is missing. So is there a perspective, a vantage point, a lived experience, a disparity, an incongruency with your mission or values? We work with a lot of nonprofits who, when they do a reflection on their mix, they come to realize we actually don't represent the communities that we're partnering with or that we're serving or that our mission intends to impact. So a lot of times it's saying, okay, you want to mix up your race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, mixture of people. Why? Let's make a connection to your values or your mission or the thing that you are doing. What is missing? We know that in the United States right now, there are workforce disparities across lines of race and gender in every sector and every community. And what's the really specific thing in our context that we want to do?
Yeah, and I think just reiterating what you said, the why is so important. And when any of us think about, and I'm somebody who still feels really close to my biological family, how I was parented, right? You know, sometimes parents have to say things like, because I said so.
Right.
Right? That's happened to all of us because our little childhood brains just couldn't understand the complexity of why this was the rule or why we couldn't do that or why we had to do this. And I think because we choose to work with adults, too many people are underestimating their own ability to handle complexity, right? And so we actually think a lot about the business case of why mixed teams are so innovative or have this capacity to be creative. And so some of the things I think about is related to goals is the why should be really grounded. And so a good example, we know a lot of folks are really thinking about education disparities in America. They are so consistent across decades, and they are so pronounced across race, right? It's clear that our K-12 system is really designed for white kids, right? And as a white person, I had a great experience in school and was consistently sort of effective. When I look at anybody who learns differently than me, it's like, oh, wow, our education system just is not flexible enough to leverage the best out of all of these kids. But if we come at our goals from just because it's nice or because it's the right thing to do, sure, that seems to not be a good enough reason to anchor into wholesale change. And so here in Minnesota, right, we know that LGBT kids are having a worse experience in school than straight kids. We know that Indigenous second graders are testing the lowest in terms of reading level. And so when we think about mix, for example, the idea of having LGBT adults, Indigenous adults on the case trying to fix these gaps, it's like, that's just smart. If something's going on in a community that I can't understand because I'm not a part of it, also that idea of, okay, so here is my goal. It's not just, I want one of every kind of person because the photo will look cool, right? It's, I actually want to fix these problems, and I have enough self-awareness to know I don't even fully understand why the problem's occurring. So if we actually believe that people who are embedded in communities are the ones probably closest to the answers, it makes really good sense, right? And so it's not willy-nilly. There has to be sort of some anchoring to the goals.
And I want to zoom in on two things that you said. One was sort of about if we're doing kind of make the feel-good case, like we're just supposed to, or it just would feel better. And then the other one is about sort of that specificity that comes when you have greater self-awareness of what is actually going on. So what can happen, I think, when organizations or leaders are just saying, oh, it's just like a good to do thing, or we just really should do that because we've been missing the mark on this, but we don't have any sort of stronger case for why, is we can actually end up tokenizing people, or we can have goals that don't have good teeth to sort of grab into something. So if we're just saying just because it would be nice, or just because there's like this moral case, that can be motivating for someone, but we need something more to sink into. And so the self-awareness piece helps us get a more specific goal. So I might ask myself, why do I keep hiring the same kind of people? Why do my employees regularly report not feeling welcomed, included, and like they matter? Why does our system regularly produce directors and vice presidents who are white and male, right? So I can reflect on my participation in a system and start to understand, oh, I have a preference for a certain kind of people because I spend my social time with that kind of person. I then create an environment that really works for those kind of people. And then that environment creates an outcome at the systemic level that advantages those kinds of people. So the self-awareness lets me get a really specific goal. So I, as a leader, and I think we've talked a lot about this in our hiring, is we reflect on what are our implicit preferences that we have toward or against something, because there has been a hierarchy created that preferences masculinity and whiteness.
Right.
So for me, it's saying in my goal setting, what do I know to be true about my own experience as a queer man of color? And how have environments been created for me or not for me? And then not getting stuck in the overwhelm of what I might discover, but then being really clear about the thing that I want to be different. And I have a story about a client actually that we were talking about. I won't use any names, but it was about this sort of sense of overwhelm that we're just sort of generally trying to be more equitable and more inclusive. And they were building a program. They were writing a description about the program, and the program was for students of color. And they realized right before they went to print, someone said, you know, we're using a lot of language that says they, and we're using a lot of language that sort of talks about students of color as other, rather than talking about this community experience that the program was actually trying to create? And they said, we've been trying so hard to be equitable and inclusive. And then our conversation was around, but did you have really specific goals around how you were going to pay attention to and edit your language and your communications and your marketing materials? You didn't. So of course you reinforced a preference, or you reinforced an otherness, because there wasn't a focus on what could be different or better about our communications.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. There's a couple anchoring points that I want our listeners to be able to sort of grab on from that. And I think the first thing is that you were really clear. Our goals are for us. Way too often we hear adults have goals for other people, right? It's like, well, I have a goal for that department or that manager or that intern. And you said in that self-awareness piece, so what are my goals? The folks we work with, I think both love and hate every time we say a very important true thing, which is, we are the only adults in our control, right? And so often we want to be pointing the finger at other people. So thinking about goals. And then the other thing I think your story really landed on is goals should always be taking context in mind. It doesn't mean that they're so like movable that they just blow in the wind, but it is, okay, what specifically is happening? And that idea of, I'm actually asking questions because I don't have all the information yet. So of course I should be willing to be influenced and changed by as I get more information or as the context becomes more clear to me. And I love that you reference something you say a lot, and I think it's beautiful because it paints such a picture. People are often captured by the enormity of injustice, and it just feels like from the onslaught of news when we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to bed, it's like it's too big. It's just too big for us to fix. And so I think when we think of goal setting in a specific actionable way, it can feel incredibly empowering. And it's the difference between, like you said, tokenizing and sort of one-off behavior, like I caught this one time, to thinking, hey, it's a goal of mine to thread and embed an awareness around disability, to thread and embed recognition of an Indigenous experience, to thread and embed the awareness of the gender pay gap. It's like, right, we can just zoom in, and it means every day we can do something actionable, which I think helps with that feeling of overwhelm.
Absolutely. And I bet at this point, any of you listening are going, yeah, I get it. It's complex. We have to be specific. I have to do self-awareness. I need to dig in on my own experience of whatever aspect of identity I'm thinking of. So maybe after the break, you and I can workshop some of the goals we have for ourselves in our leadership and management and sort of pull that process apart.
Perfect. You're listening to Behave, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. So Alfonso, let's use our framework of role, goal, and soul, because it's what we use to really think about, okay, role, how am I focusing on who I am, both my identity and my position? Goal, what am I trying to do next? So what is right in front of me? Not the forever way out front, but like today in my practice. What is my goal? And then soul, what are those sort of guiding values that are calling us to courageous action, right? So when I don't want to do something, and I think, okay, but I'm actually going to feel out of my integrity unless I take this action, try this thing, stop this behavior. Should we try one at a time?
Yeah, let's go. Will you go first?
Oh, God. Yes.
And if anyone's following along, producer Levi will post our PDF of our Role Goal Soul worksheet next to the description of the episode.
Yep. And so for folks who are new to listening, we really try to bring you tools that our team uses regularly. And so these are tools that we've developed about our own goals. So when I'm thinking about one of the goals I have right now related to my role as CEO of Team Dynamics is we're actually about to have a staff retreat this week.
Yeah.
And so I'm really thinking about my positional power and my identity power as a white woman who has been an executive director 2 times. So I'm thinking about my role of really listening to the lived experiences of our team without projecting all of my stuff onto their experience. So I think it's going to be hard. I think I can do it. How about you?
So I'm thinking about the fact that I am a leader on a team that is more than 50% Latinx folks.
Yep.
As a Latinx person.
Yep.
And my goal is around creating an environment where people can really have a specificity to their particular racial or ethnic experience, so that we are regularly talking about how we are coming at an issue, because I think folks might look at our team and see me and Mark and Luciano and Andrea and Maria Isabel and see 5 people and be like, bunch of Mexicans.
Yeah.
Right?
It's not
We're
true.
not.
Nope.
We're not. The mix is really different, right? So of the 5 of us, we speak different languages. We are of different ethnicities. Our family origins are of different places. And we fall under this umbrella of having a Latinx or Latino, Latina identity, right? So I'm trying to create an environment where we can talk about that specificity and we can be excited about the fact that we fall into the same bucket, and at the same time can talk about the really different and distinct experiences we're having through that lens as a result of things like the colonization of Puerto Rico, U.S. relationship to Central and South America, the Mexican-American border, being folks who live in the Midwest, island culture versus sort of North American culture, right?
Yep.
Like all of those different things are at play. And so when I think about a value that is really important to me and that will be important to ground that practice of allowing space for people to talk about specificity rather than glossing over like the Latinx folks on the team think, blah.
Sure.
It's connection. And I think it's connection to my own story so
Sure.
that I just know like, this is my story, but it's also allowing other people to be super connected to their story and not feeling a need to do compare and contrast. Just say like, if this is a jigsaw puzzle or like patchwork of different experiences, the question can be like, not how is mine like yours, but how can we use all of that well and respectfully and authentically on our team, and like what aspects of that story feel relevant that you want to talk about at work and what aspects are sort of in process that maybe you don't want on the table.
Right. Okay, related to goal, I'm going to do 2. So one of the goals that I have for myself that I'm working on right now is around ability and disability. I have been really practiced in some ways of doing accessibility of our content, and I've rediscovered recently that I keep conflating people's experiences. So I think I'm doing a thing that will make all of our materials accessible, for example, for visually impaired people or for folks for whom English is a second language. And then new things get brought into my awareness. And so I'm really committed right now to figuring out how we're going to ask better questions more consistently of the participants in the room that we lead, so that I'm not making assumptions about here's who has computer programs, here's who needs a PDF, here's who needs a sans serif font, here, right? And so it's like I can just ask rather than sometimes I think I'm doing some ego protection by not asking and assuming I can just get it right and then be proud of myself. So I want to just build into my practice a better job of asking so that I'm not guessing and getting it wrong. Another goal I have right now is really helping people think about an entirely new sort of paradigm shift around inclusion. We're watching people do some funky stuff by committee these days. And so I think, again, that gap between intent and impact is just sort of major right now, where we know that people alone making decisions by themselves is often not the best way, just because we're all limited by our own experience. But we've watched people sort of, the pendulum has swung all the way the other direction, which is let's decide everything constantly by committee and vote. And you and I know that unless you have a high self-awareness in a group, dominance is going to dominate. So the idea that our bias shows up in a group and we can vote on a bad idea and call it democracy, it's really scary. We have to be conscious of that too, right? We're a team and we know everybody's smart. So the idea of like, shouldn't we just make these decisions together because we're all really smart?
Well, and we, as people who've done election work, can say with confidence every time we have turned major decisions over to the general voting populace, we have not voted in the best interest of women and people of color and LGBTQ people. We have a history as voters of voting against the safety, well-being, success, ability to sort of thrive and be whole of women, LGBTQ people, and people of color. So why wouldn't that be true on a micro level in our organizations if we haven't addressed the ways in which dominance preferences whiteness and masculinity?
Right. So one of my goals right now is to sort of unpack what I think of as sort of this like math problem, which is people are making an assumption that A plus B equals C. So if we have an important decision, we should put a bunch of people in the room and then therefore we'll have an inclusive decision output. That's just not true, right? Singular individuals can make inclusive decisions or non-inclusive decisions, and whole groups can make not inclusive decisions or inclusive decisions. And so helping people really start to think about and trying to use our examples of how we make different decisions differently, because we have different expertise, we have different lived experience, and we also have to be really clear about how we're making decisions so it doesn't just feel like it's behind the curtain or sort of unclear. So that's my other goal right now, is to really help people think about how we do decision making.
And what about soul for you, Trina? What are the values that are really driving your behavior?
Great question. I sort of reverse engineer my way there. I know right now that I'm having a hard time being patient consistently. And so I think the thing that's going to help me from a values perspective is anchoring in my deep knowing that listening is going to make me smarter. And so needing to figure out ways for myself that include taking notes so I'm not talking, making sure I have a good night's sleep and I've eaten, being prepared for meetings so that I'm not taking up more space than is needed, and remembering that there are multiple options. And so I think that other value of creativity, that I just know there's more than one way to get to things. And just because I thought of plan A doesn't mean that plan B isn't genius, brilliant, more appropriate, or just an option. And so I'm trying to sort of remember to hold really tightly to my goal and my values, but really lightly to how we get there so that I don't get grabby about it always being my way.
So one of the things that we've been saying to our clients a lot lately is if you're feeling sort of lost, or if the next move isn't clear, then your goal probably isn't specific enough.
Yes.
So if you're saying we want to have an inclusive and equitable environment for everybody, that's like great in terms of messaging. It gets trickier when you're actually thinking about adjusting day-to-day behavior. So who is the everybody in your context?
Right.
For whom can we predict based on systemic outcomes? Are they having a less than ideal experience,
right,
maybe a discriminatory or violent experience in
right,
your system? So what specific choices, if on the way to everybody does well here?
Yeah. Who's the everybody?
Who's the everybody? And that means there's some bodies that aren't doing as well.
Right.
So let's get specific about the changes that we need to make.
Yeah, I want to close today by just saying this can feel like a lot. And so one of the other things we can make sure Levi puts up on the website for folks is our diversity, equity, and inclusion roadmap. It's a way to just go step by step by step by step. And for us, I would say, or I'll speak for myself, the reason this work remains tolerable 18 years into doing it is every day you sort of get back on the horse and say, okay, what is in my control today? And so I think working with you has helped me have a place to articulate my goals, because I used to just keep them in my head a lot. And so I also think sometimes that act of sharing your goals with your colleagues, not just so people can hold you accountable, but so that you're practiced articulating them so that you can start driving towards them. So I also just really appreciate how you and I get to talk about our goals. And they're not always the same every week, every day, every month.
Rarely, if ever.
Rarely, if ever.
So we're curious, how are you thinking about goals? What are you doing for goal setting when it comes to race, gender, other aspects of identity, and how you're creating an environment where people say, I matter, and that you can't predict that the system is creating inequities for certain identities? How are you doing goal setting? Send us a tweet at Team Dynamics LLC. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Thanks for hanging out today. Make good choices. Behave is produced by Levi Weinhagen in Studio G at the Glenn Nelson Center.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Because I like the sitting across.
This morning on Behave.
Can I say two more things that don't make any sense about life?